All right, today's May 16th, 2019. Thanks, Steve. Chen,
Great.
YouTube. We're coming to continue your oral history. I'm Marguerite Hancock with Marc Weber, interviewing you on behalf of the Computer History Museum.
Great.
We had such a great conversation last time. We'd like to continue on where we left off, and we were just talking about pitching to Sequoia and your interest in, there was a lot of strong interest in you, and you were thinking about who you would like to work with as an investor. And I had asked you whether you knew about or you still had your pitch deck, and you said you knew it out there somewhere, so we found it.
Yeah.
And for people who are really trying to understand kind of the essence of YouTube and your mind at the time, would like to ask you if you would be willing to kind of walk through those initial pages and tell us what you were thinking about as you made the pitch.
Sure.
And then also any comments on now in retrospect. Has your vision changed? Would you, reflecting back, would you have pitched it any differently? Was it just, and I'll just hand this if you want to refer to it all.
Well, it was great that you found this, because this kind of a flashback to, 14 years ago? And so as I was reading this last night in the email attachment, just about every page was almost a chapter in a new novel. I don't remember writing this or being responsible for it, but looking through it, it makes a lot of sense. However, I think that, one, I do remember that this was put together in 48 hours, right? And so we had been working on this on YouTube, building it, sustaining it, launching it, and then scaling it virally for months. And so this took up less than 0.5% of that time to actually create. And I think that one thing that I think we constantly see now as a kind of an evolution of Silicon Valley, and maybe the ease in which people will be doing from the angel investment side of things to VCs, I think they're all a little bit more, versus the rest of the world, a little bit more relaxed when it comes to writing a check. And I think the difference there is in 2005, we had, at the end of this deck, it's the metrics. And it's not to sound arrogant, but when we went into this presentation, even with Sequoia Capital, even with some of the top VCs where, they only say yes to just a tiny sliver of the number of people that are actually presenting to them in their conference rooms. We just knew that there was, I think with these decks, the first part of it is the sort of the high-level purpose, one sentence about what the company's trying to do, the solutions that it's trying to provide to some problem. And maybe just like patents, you try to be as general as possible and then see what comes out of that. And then, there's a little bit more details on what exactly definition of that problem that you're trying to solve and the solution. And this is mostly just, a little bit of photos and a little bit of bullet point text. But I think what we thought was going to just, the reason why we only spent 2 days on it was that we were so convinced that there was no way that we were going to leave that room without getting a check. And it was, as you flip through the last few pages of the doc, it's just the numbers and the metrics. And specifically, it was many times those numbers were doubling every week, every 2 weeks. So the number of views would go from 100 to, early on, I think we talked about this last time, early on it's easy to double when you're getting 100 views to 200 views.
Yeah, easy.
Although in terms of pure absolute numbers, although that sounds easy, it is still an indicator that the application, the software, is catching on. Maybe not at the 1 to 2, 2 to 4, but as it gets to even 500 views to 1,000 views, it does mean that over a period of 7 days, the daily number of people grew from 500 views, 600 views, 700 views. And of course, you hope that keeps up. But if the actual engineering side of things can sustain it, there's no reason that the actual app itself won't be able to continue that level of growth. And so looking at this deck, I remember it was the better portion of it was just talking about what we were trying to do with YouTube. But once you actually get to the thick of it, it was the metrics, and it was talking about when we launched in mid-June, and starting from then until looking at this. So the last numbers here are about late September, and so during those 3 months, it was showing that there was just for the key metrics we look at, the number of videos uploaded, the number of times that, most importantly, number of times that all the videos are viewed on the site on a daily basis, and then just number of registered users. Although the registered users was not a key metric early on, because most of the time there's no incentive to register on YouTube unless you were going to upload a video. You just watch videos, and we were going to do recommendations whether or not you were registered or not. And so just those 3 key pages about the metrics was enough to say that there's something here. And I think that I alluded to this before too, was that YouTube is different in that it was basically fighting itself. It was challenging itself to say, can you survive? There was no other competitor in the game. It was whether or not the internet could serve as the platform medium to be able to serve streaming videos at a sort of an economically feasible rate. So I think that different from maybe the typical deck that's spent now, where there's a lot of going back and forth and many iterations from drafts to the final copy. I know that we were having lunch, and we were still making corrections, spelling mistakes, whatnot, right before we actually took off to go to Sequoia for the presentation. But there were a few interested parties there, and so I think we were just confident that the metrics was going to be convincing enough, regardless of how much professional effort we put into the deck itself.
So the conversation, once you were there, was Pierre, was he there for the original?
The way that it works is that
take us back to that sort of pitch. How did that conversation go?
So the pitch generally happens with a few of the general partners there, and then if you get the first thumb of approval, then you go back to whether it's 1, 2, 3 more meetings to do the same presentation, and to be able to make sure that you are on site to be able to answer any of the questions and to present to all the partners, which makes it not just one presentation that you have to be prepared for to answer the Q&A, but multiple ones. But I think that it speaks well for Sequoia and other VCs to make sure that all the partners are in agreement, rather than having maybe internal strifes between certain partners believe in and certain partners don't. And I think there is the wide variation between different venture capitals about how they actually approve or disapprove of the deals that they want to commit to.
So I asked last time, did you celebrate? And I think you said not so much. Is that right? You came away with not an insignificant amount of funding commitment. Right?
Right. Well, in 2005 era, certainly, some of the funding amounts these days are 2 orders of magnitude more than what we saw back then. But I think not just the amount. I think that's unfair to say. I think that just general market, it's not so much about small length of time during this sort of private phase, and then it has to grow quickly for potential acquisitions of public. I think that the total timeline for YouTube was 1.5 years between fundraising and acquisition, whereas now it's 5, 6, 7, 8 years before potential acquisition or IPO opportunities, and there's a lot more private investments that's going on rather than just going public right away.
So for that Series A, was the just for the record, the dollar amount commit was at $3.5 million.
Right.
Is that right?
Right.
And that was part of Sequoia Capital. Was that Fund 11, I think, or something in that?
Yeah.
And it was a significant portion of that time. And you were confident going in, and what was different after you came out with the funding? What was different for you than the next day now that you had an increased capital to work with?
I think that there were just a number of changes from, for example, changing from an LLC to an S corp. I mean, things became more serious. We had an office location, and so we were no longer working from home, but we were working at Sequoia Capital. Gave us a portion of their Sand Hill Road office building to be able to sort of call it an office. And so all of a sudden the sort of the employees started coming in and meeting together rather than just doing most of the work from home and then occasional coffee meetings. People were put onto finally salaries and taxes, and you're actually filing tax forms. It became an actual real company rather than just doing this stuff at home, and it's seeming like it's just an afternoon project rather than your full-time job.
Were there some people that quit day jobs at that point to go take it on full time?
Yeah, and we had probably, I can't remember exactly, 6-7 people at the time of the Sequoia investment. I don't know exactly the number of exactly who was in what category, but there's things where we had a file for somebody like an H-1B visa, like we were able to finally do that, whereas before there's just a lot of these things that we were waiting for that we could only start checking off after the investment. And we started looking for an office building, which we eventually found in San Mateo. We started looking for outside PR to actually come up with the communication, the messaging for what YouTube is. None of this really crossed our minds before the investing from Sequoia. It was just trying to build something.
Can you say more about your relationship with your VC? Many people talk about Silicon Valley style venture capital being not only about money, but about all these other sort of value added, whether it's connecting to market or helping match with partners or building the team or mentoring. What was your relationship like with your Sequoia investors?
I think what a typical VC would bring to the table would be I think definitely experience, having seen both successes and failures hundreds and hundreds of times for decades. And I feel similarly that if I were to be starting something again, I would probably avoid some of the mistakes that we made at YouTube and probably be more efficient at creating something new, as well as advising new companies. And I think that that's for a very short segment of time that I had, and primarily working in a specific sector and primarily working in just a few roles. I think when you talk about somebody like Sequoia, who's just seen the growth of just technology in Silicon Valley altogether, the entire spectrum of it, they have a I think one of the top VCs in Silicon Valley altogether. They've just seen everything, and so it really helps to be able to send an email and give a call to be able to get the responses back for what we were trying to do. I think the number of connections that they've been able to grow over a period of time. So if we needed something from an example was just scaling the site. I think the alluded to this before as well, but YouTube's competitor was just market pricing whether or not it could actually exist. And if you were to elaborate on that, it became technology. Whether the technology was cheap enough, bandwidth was cheap enough, or if there was a way to utilize the bandwidth and the providers to be cheap enough to be able to scale the site. But it's extremely helpful to be able to have others that have been in the game for a long time to be able to just ask questions to. And so a good example is Tony Bates, who was like an SVP over at Cisco at the time, and he was affiliated with Sequoia, and Sequoia Capital gave us the reference, and we were able to sit down with our networking team with Tony for a few meetings, and eventually Tony actually came and joined the board of YouTube. So those are the things that that they were very generous in offering. We didn't have to. There was no. It was more an offering, and it was always a decision that we could make whether or not we wanted to work with whoever they supplied or not. But overall, that was very helpful. And then eventually, because of all the past history and their experience with other companies that have either gone public or been acquired, they either route that we wanted to go, and eventually we went down the acquisition route, but either route that we wanted to go, they have so much historical knowledge and, again, experience, but also hands-on board seats in some of these companies. And so that's something as well that Sequoia brings to the table that you would be difficult to get if you were just to get funding from an angel investor or a VC that has not been in the market as long as Sequoia has.
Great, thank you. So you're on this rocket ship, and we're talking about viewers. I mean, these key metrics, a set of key metrics that you're looking at, it's as fast up and to the right really as almost any kind of a phenomenon at the time. And can you talk a little bit more about the scaling part of the technology? You described in some detail about figuring out how to get the codecs to work with all of them, but how about the scaling time that after that's just that period of rapid growth? How are you solving those problems?
This dives into a little bit of the details of what we had to do from the technology side, right? I think some of the services out there that were growing at the same time that YouTube was launching, they were facing some of the same challenges, but it was generally in a single category, whether or not it's scalability on just hard drive storage, or scalability in networking, just to be able to get faster caching in some of the CDN networks out there. And things like the amount of memory that's used. For example, there's some of this stuff by a company called Audible Magic at the time that we were working with that I would actually look at certain videos with audio coming in, and then within 10 to 30 seconds they would be able to detect whether or not this is a piece of copyrighted content and who the licensing was for that. But that requires a lot of fast processing, a lot of stuff that's actually stored in memory, and then fast response times with networking. Just an example, but YouTube, it required everything on that list. It required storage. Every time you uploaded a piece of video, the original format is generally not compressed. A lot of the time was motion JPEGs at the time taken on photos, and so that's just 23, 24 JPEGs every second. So these files were enormous. We always wanted to retain the original copies of the videos because in case new versions of the video or audio codecs come out, we could reuse the originals to retranscode. At a huge cost for us because we had to keep these large original videos. The transcoding took a lot of CPU power to be able to retranscode this content, to grab this image stills from this content, and just to do this processing every time a video is uploaded and to be able to do it somewhat real time. So after you upload something, regardless of the size, within a few seconds, it would actually be available. And that required a lot of You're uploading content into San Jose, for example. San Jose may find a server that's somewhere else that we have that actually has lower CPU usage at the time. We would sync it out there. The transcoding would happen out there. It would be replicating. It would be communicating back to the databases in San Jose that this was done. I think that another costly variable there was just network usage, both downstream and upstream. I mean, at the time, YouTube was jumping exponentially in the amount of network that we were using. In fact, I think we were the biggest network bandwidth users out there on the internet by the time the acquisition happened by Google. And so I think a lot of this was done in an era before cloud computing was even a term, before it even emerged, right? And so if we were to start that today, we could go and contract out with either Amazon, Google, or Microsoft to do this. But I think that one of the real challenges with YouTube was to have to do both. You grow out this product and you build YouTube.com, or you build the mobile product, you build the ability to be able to play these videos. But you also had to build and buy all the servers on the back end. You have to actually go and find where the data centers are. You have to be there on the ground when this 42U rack of machines comes out of that truck. You wheel it out of that truck. You wheel that into your own cages. You plug in every single one of the actual racks. You figure out the power supplies, the backup power supplies. This is stuff that as a startup these days you don't need to deal with. But not only was it a responsibility, but we were growing faster than anything else out there, and we had a team of a total of about 3 people if you're just counting the network team, and then 4 people if you count the network team plus the person that was actually doing a lot of the low-end system maintenance to bring these things up. And so these guys were traveling on the road all the time throughout those months. I mean, they were going to New Jersey, and some of these data centers, they're not in the central Manhattan. It's not a good place to be able to put the cost per square foot. So they were in the outer skirts of some place in New Jersey, and so they would have to stay in motels while they're bringing up servers for the largest video distribution company out there. So a lot of those early days was just trying to maintain the cost to be able to build out all those things that YouTube required.
And can you talk a little bit about, I know there was no one doing really what you were doing at all, but what were the closest? I mean, there were obviously torrents were around, but that's not real time.
Right.
The adult industry was doing video, I think, starting to do some sort of on-demand by then. But I mean, what were the closest sort of people dealing with trying to do real-time video, which seems very different than a lot of what was
there was definitely Google Video at the time. There was Vimeo, which is still around. There was a company out in France that was doing something as well. But I mean, YouTube already back in September of 2005, after being around for just 2-3 months, had already had grown to a point where it was pushing more traffic out than all the competitors cumulatively. So I think that it still always came down to surviving, and the faster you grow in a way, the more costly it is, the survival. And you're competing against the Googles out there when it came to something that at the end of the day you really need people on the ground with resources to be able to connect to all the networks out there, to be able to build and trying to guess, because again, it's not AWS today. It's not Amazon, where if you actually see growth coming next week, or if you see growth coming tonight, you log in and then within 30 minutes, you have all the servers you need. We had to guess 4 to 6 weeks in advance what that traffic's going to be 4 to 6 weeks later. and we had such a small checking account that you really have to get it spot on. And then because there were a lot of tricks that we pulled that ultimately resulted in sort of whether or not dead or alive we managed to survive. And some of those just helped us because none of the actual ISPs out there, as the service providers, actually has ever seen something like YouTube before. So there was a company out there that we used early on called Server Beach. They were based out of Texas, and they promoted plans to basically rent the servers on a monthly basis, and it varied anywhere from about $129 to about $229 a month. And what you would get out of that is, you choose the processor you want, the amount of memory, the amount of hard drive storage, but they offered you 2,000 gigabytes of traffic per month, fully knowing that nobody was going to push 2,000 gigabytes of traffic a month. And when we saw that, we would just, every time we needed, we would, and that was perfect. It was, I guess, an early version of AWS in that you don't have to buy the servers. You pay $229, and then within a day or two, the server comes up. It was much harder at that time to actually really prepare the servers, but we try to kind of create our own way to be able to bring up a server at the time. But we played that 2,000 gigabytes to be the only subscribers, users, customers that actually pushed that 2,000 gigabytes. And we were tracking it. Every time it came to 2,000 gigabytes, the credit card would come out to buy another server with 2,000 gigabytes. And soon, after a few weeks, they gave us a call and said, we need to talk. They had the amount of bandwidth that they had coming into their data centers. They had one main line, and then the other connection was their entire backup connection. And very quickly, YouTube took up their entire backup connection, and we were slowing down their main connection. I mean, just YouTube with our 40 servers eventually on their platform was overwhelming their entire company's incoming and outbound bandwidth. But there were items like that because we couldn't just buy our own data center like a Google could. We had to put together ways to be able to seemingly look like we were doing that, but in actuality, these machines were all over the U.S. They all had different IP addresses, and I mean, I think those were some of the most creative things that the engineering team did to be able to get by to compete with the Googles of the world on $20,000 a month.
There's two key kind of technical decisions, it seems. One is do it all on the server side. You didn't want a player that people had to download, so it's all done in a browser.
Right.
And why Flash? I mean, what's the logic behind those two?
Well, it's a combination of both, and I mean, it's the same answer. If you did it client side, you generally still upload the video, and then it could be in the form of Real Player or QuickTime or all the other codecs that were out there. The problem was that, and you have to remember back in 2004, 2005, much of the time there would be you'd be looking on a web page and there would be a video player. You knew it was a video player, but then there would be some icon inside that says download this app. Or it would just not play, and it would say this is just for Apple only, or this is for Windows only. And so two things were, we knew that in order for people to actually really adopt the service, we couldn't force them to have to download, install, write software for Apple, for Windows. And so the way that we wanted, the ideal way, was to always, and this is from day one, nothing downloaded, it had to work inside the browser. But the only way that you could get it to work inside the browser is to use a codec that was available on all machines. At the time, Flash was more or less embedded into all the browsers. I mean, you had to still download it, but it was the only way to be able to overcome some of the limitations of HTML4 at the time, to make just applications richer, to make them and to be able to play audio and video. And so in 2005, Flash was able to get an embedded video player with its own codec into Flash. And so all of a sudden, all the browsers out there that had Flash installed could actually start playing videos. And so we knew that we needed to keep all the videos, the original videos, on our servers. We also knew that we had to transcode all the videos into Flash. The bulk of the time was actually spent in building these transcoders to be able to understand all the different hundreds of codecs coming in, to be able to transcode them all into one video codec, audio codec, to be able to pull image stills out of it, to be able to synchronize the sound, the audio and video. There's a lot of little things there where to be able to compress videos a little bit more. You don't have synchronization all the time with the audio and video, and there's differences with the different codecs out there. So some of the early videos out there, you could see the mouth moving, but the audio codec would just be slightly behind or slightly ahead of things. And that was just the technology at that point. It was just certain video codecs and audio codecs were hard to be able to transcode to Flash.
I could follow on with a business decision. There are a lot of advertisers, and you were thinking about sort of the business model that you're going to have and your sources of revenue, and it seems that a lot of advertisers really wanted to make sure that the advertisements were absolutely necessary before watching. And you and Chad made a different kind of decision. Do you want to talk about your approach to that, the business model that you had in mind, of what you were weighing, and how did you make that decision?
I think that at the time we were always thinking that Series A funding round was purely for scaling YouTube, purely for number of views, and the company and everything else behind it, the staffing, the engineering, the actual hardware, the operational costs. But it was not for building out some kind of monetization strategy, but it was just for scalability of the website. And so the only metric we cared about back then, again, were the number of views a day. It wasn't how much advertising revenue we were generating, right? And so at the time, it was that was an easy decision. And then also, I think when we were starting to even brainstorm about marketing and advertising, the easy route would always be these pre-rolls, 15 seconds in front of the video, and the CPM rates on those pre-rolls, because it's video, it's a lot higher than what you would typically get on just a graphics ad. You can put interstitials, so as you're watching different videos, as you're going through related videos, you put another advertising video that you have to watch for 8 seconds or 15 seconds before you close it. And there's different levels of ads that you can put with different CPM rates. You know, some of them are 30 seconds, some of them are 15 seconds, some of them are just a few seconds. But when I looked at all the services out there that were more or less advertising driven, that being the revenue rather than some kind of subscription fee, I was most inspired by Google, because I thought that you would search for something on Google and the actual results would be helpful, but sometimes the ads would be helpful, because the ads would be coming from advertisers that were specifically buying ads for the keywords that you were searching for. So they were the most relevant advertisers, marketers that are actually in that market that you're searching for something. And so in a way, I think that there are always three parties. There's on YouTube specifically, there are the viewers, there's the content creators, and then there's the advertisers. And to try to create this sort of holy trinity between the three where they're all happy with one another, by default, most of the services out there, it's not. Either the users dislike the advertisers have to work with the content creators, but the content creators don't really want it doesn't work well. But I think in a model where you have advertisers that have relevant advertising and then you're playing the video so the viewers want to see both the content as well as some of the advertising, and then the advertisers do some kind of rev share with the content creators. That way creates this sort of bi-directional relationship that everybody appreciates. But that's jumping way ahead. I think that those were more conversations that we were having about how do you actually pull this off? How do you actually create this advertising with a video site without the users hating it? Because it is a serial experience. Your eyes, your ears can only be watching one piece of content at one time. So you're either watching advertising or you're watching content. But that didn't come until much further down the line when it came to implementation. I think that just because the entire service was new as well in 2005, there were really no, people were just in general not even scared. They didn't even know what they were dealing with when it came to actually creating ads for an online video site. They didn't have all the marketing advertising agencies. They were not used to creating this type of content. They were used to creating content for commercials on TV, completely sitting back, and there's no interaction. There's no, there's not complete relevance in what you're watching and what you're actually advertising for. There's always this fear that it's user-generated content. We have no idea what's going to be on the related videos on the side. We have no idea if we put this ad on this video, whether or not we're going to be offended because these two are completely unrelated to one another. And then there's the legal side of things with that DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyrights Act, that says you can't monetize with relevant advertising on the piece of content. And so in essence, it defines that in order to stay within legal limits, we can't actually implement what we wanted to implement, which is to take a look to be able to get the contextual reference for the ads based on what the user is watching, what the user has seen before, what the related videos are, and then show the most relevant videos, because that is the clause in the DMCA that we couldn't obstruct.
We'll get to some of the legal issues, but I wanted to ask you about kind of the path that you were following for partnership. The story goes, I think you were looking at Google and Yahoo. I'm not sure what other companies that you were considering. What were you looking for at that time when you were thinking about partners and conversation? Was there a certain Denny's in Redwood City that you?
Oh, but that would be fast forwarding to acquisition.
Acquisition.
Yeah. Right. I think probably the biggest challenge to YouTube Inc. itself, not technology, not scalability. At that time, by fast forwarding a year after our first and second round of funding, we were confident that the engineering side of survival was, well, I wouldn't say that it was guaranteed, because that small team of 20, 30 engineers, they've been running on vapors for so long that it was going to be difficult. But there's a lot of excitement around it. There was always new applicants that were coming in that were highly qualified engineers, and I thought that if we wanted to, with good management, with the engineering team, we could always scale that part. The difficult part was on the legal side of things, and specifically in this case, it was the music studios, labels inside the U.S. So you have the Universals, the EMIs, Sonys, and whether or not the users knew it or not, you can buy a CD and you feel like you own that music, but you don't own that piece of content. You just own the private use of that content. And so you're sitting in your car and listening to this, that's fine. But if you want to play this even at even just in the background at an event, that's that's not legal for actually buying this. You have to get licensing, you have to get agreements to be able to do that, which is, usually that's not a problem. If you want to be playing this at a party, that's going to be fine. Once you actually start putting it on YouTube and you're getting 10 million views of this, then it starts getting problematic. And we worked with companies like Audible Magic out there, and that was a company that was got the stamp of approval from these music studios and music labels to say if you work with them, then you can detect when a piece of content comes in with content with music that we own, and then you can then tell the users whether or not to take out this piece of music, strip out the audio, or work with us for potential licensing. And as part of the DMCA in 1990, which was created in 1997, I mean, the policy should be, if you actually detect a piece of a content that is infringing, you're supposed to fax something to the infringing party, and I think it goes back 3 times, or there's like 3 different times that you can fill it. Then, I mean, it was just completely using kind of an outdated law to try to reinterpret it for like almost a decade later, what it meant. We had what was the other server? Beach server. There was another company that we were using just to host our web servers, websites, and our the database. And so there was we had to centralize that because we actually had the web servers load balance, and so physically they had to be in one spot, and then we had a database that had to be physically on the same local area network. And they ended up terminating our agreement because we were infringing on some of the DMCA laws, and then they were the ones that were actually getting the notifications. In reality, they didn't have anything to worry about. It was just us. But just because it was completely foreign to everybody that was engaged in this, they just terminated our agreement. And so we had to eventually move and buy our own web servers and buy our own databases and buy our own racks and machines from Equinix, and then and install it in Equinix data centers. But it just goes to say, like, all throughout this period early on, as we were building out, the biggest problems were actually on the legal side of things. And nobody's seen anything like this before. Even now, to this day,
right?
YouTube is the most popular way to be able to listen to music in the world right now, and that's surprising given that it's a video site, not an audio site.
But this was right in the sort of moment. Napster was a few years before the iPod and iTunes Store were starting to get big. Were those models at all? What was, good or bad, looking at the music industry? Or online music?
Yes, I think that, I think Napster, when it came to exactly internet streaming audio, it's a precursor to YouTube. And in a way, they also try to shield themselves from legal troubles using the DMCA. And looking back, it really comes down to how the company defines what its mission is, what its intent is, and how it actually kind of communicates to the public about what it's trying to do. And YouTube was always about user-generated content. As soon as when we were working in tandem, as soon as there's a piece of content that came up that was detected by Audible Magic to say this is not infringing, but this is there's a questionable copyrights, you need to do something about it. We did it, and we worked in collaboration with all the artists and all the studios. Napster didn't, and Napster was shut down. But always in the back of our minds was, this is really an ambiguous area of what you can actually do and what you can't do. And it's still the case. I mean, even today, what is the EU trying to do with YouTube? What is the US trying to do with YouTube? Should you have to? I mean, it's nearly impossible to do this, to be able to look at a piece of content that's being uploaded and to listen to maybe that song that's playing on the TV in the background and to know who's the singer behind this, who's the lyric writer, who's the composer of this song that could have been from the 1960s. Nobody even has that information, but we're supposed to be the ones that's responsible for revenue that's generated on that. And we're talking maybe 25 cents out of 1,000 views, right? So you're talking less than a penny. Who to divide up that less than a penny to? And nobody has this information. And there's the difficulty in 2005, 2006 to do this. It was impossible, but we were responsible for it. And even today, it's the case where in the EU, how do you really decide that this piece of content is too violent, too graphical? It's completely relative to the person that's viewing it. And culturally, I think you have pieces of content that could be viewed as offensive in the US, that's fine in the EU, that's offensive in Thailand, that's fine anywhere in the world, fine in the Middle East, but not in, and I think that how do you really look at this and be able to interpret it in a way that is supposed to be objective for this website to be able to host all this traffic? And that was always a problem that we were dealing with at YouTube early on. That's still a problem at YouTube even now, as you start getting pieces of content with, say, fake news. Like, how do you know a piece of news is fake, and are you supposed to take it down? Are you supposed to keep it up? Is everything that's supposed to be uploaded supposed to be authentic and genuine? How do you actually decide that? I mean, it becomes, you just take down all pieces of content from Fox News? Do you take down all pieces of content that's being uploaded you can't keep everything up, but you can't take everything down either. So that spot in between, I mean, there was always content that everybody would agree that we should be taken down, but there was a policy where you could actually flag content that says this content is offensive. We got that for just about every video. Everybody found every video, at least one person found one video on the site offensive. So you have to just ignore some of this, and you can't expect that everybody working around the clock can make the same decisions when that comes up. And so we ended up creating almost a sort of an encyclopedia about all the types of content. When it comes to anything related to sex, it's all right, what is educational versus what is, it's like, okay, graphical is fine, but what does that even mean when it becomes educational versus not educational, when it becomes offensive? Violent, same thing. What is exactly deemed violent, what is not? And then the copyright thing, I think that's completely on the legal side of things, and ultimately, these were the things that we were trying to face outside of engineering. Was as pieces of content came up, what do you keep? What do you take down? What are the policies that you take if the same users continually upload content that is offensive or copyrighted? And so things like a 3-strike rule that we implemented, where anytime you upload a piece of content that was infringing on copyrights, we would give you a warning if you actually get all 3 strikes, so that you get all the content taken down. But this was our good faith interpretation of what we could do best in abiding by the DMCA. And that's a key differentiator between what YouTube was doing and Napster. We were trying to do the best we could, assuming that a user-generated content video site could exist.
It may have been a sweet spot that people are generally less interested in user-generated music than they are in video. I mean, they want professionally produced music, whereas video, obviously, there's a huge demand for not full studio type stuff, user-generated.
Yes, but I think there's that in-between spot, which is user-generated video. Video contains both the video itself and the audio, and generally you're not creating. You're creating all the creativity and writing and everything, the acting, the composition of the video itself. But generally, people like to have some kind of soundtrack in the background of recognizable music tunes, and that's when the music labels come in and say, no, you can't do this. And so ultimately it came down to survival was not because of the scalability and the technology and the funding, but it became on the legal side. Can YouTube sustain its, can YouTube still be around because of the sort of vacancy area when it came to the legal side, and specifically the audio side of videos? And that was still at the time just US, right? And so at the time it was just a little bit ahead. All viewing traffic was coming from the US, but it was it was starting to slide the other way. So it was almost 50-50. The 50% of the views were coming from the US and 50% of the views were coming from outside the US. And the two countries that were number 2 and number 3 was Germany and Japan. And there was a lot of content that was coming from Japan. A lot of this anime content that people in the world would want to watch. But to be honest, there was even the content creators and the distributors, up until YouTube, there was no way for someone in Japan, even if they knew that there was a large global audience for this, there was actually no channel for them to distribute it. So YouTube was a way to be able to distribute it, whether or not legally or not. But there was always, I mean, in the future after the acquisition, it was working in collaboration to be able to figure this out. But at the time, it was also, look, we're having enough trouble dealing with just figuring out how YouTube is supposed to operate with all these sort of outdated laws. And then this was just within the confines of the US. And so how do we actually start expanding beyond the US? And that would actually be going into country by country, working with the studios and the music labels country by country about how can we operate within, how can we actually put data centers and servers in order to monetize in a country, in order to work with the marketing and the advertising and the companies inside the country, we had to be legally operating inside the country. And so it's one thing, I think you can only get away with it so long, to say we're a US company and we're not, it's great that there are people coming in from different parts of the world to view the content, and it's great that there are people that are different parts of the world uploading this content. We couldn't get away with that for long, especially when over the majority of the traffic was coming from outside the US. So for a lot of those reasons, we sought out maybe help from a bigger brother, right? Help with somebody that's been in this market and have teams in all these different countries that actually have both, relationship with the content creators and lawyers.
So anything else you want to say about that? Thank you for walking us through the whole legal side of the story and how important that was at that juncture. Is there anything else you want to say about the legal part before we kind of fast forward to your partnership and acquisition? During this middle phase, I mean, it's such a compressed history, right, that we're talking about. So much happened in just a short amount of time, but you dealt with so many key issues. We've talked about the technical part and the kind of the engineering scalability.
Right.
We just talked about the legal issues, which turned out to be huge and unprecedented because of the outdated legal system. Talked a little bit about kind of the business decisions you were making. Anything else in this time of rapid change that you want to talk about?
Well, I think at the high level, what we've seen is internet without a YouTube or anything like it internet with the early phases of YouTube, where people just didn't know how to deal with it, and it grew much faster than anyone had anticipated, to the point where over a period of years, all of a sudden, the mass amount of your music content, your video content was actually being distributed on YouTube. There were more competitive content that's actually creating just on YouTube that actually competes with the content that you've created inside your own studios. So you have a lot of these content creators that the first reaction was always, we don't know who you are, but we don't want our content on here, take it down. And then fast forward, just measured in years, it's, we need to work with you. We need to put up our content on your, we need to work with you. We need to actually put our content on YouTube, because that's the only place that people, that's the only place that people are watching content. So the traditional media outlets, it's okay to be putting it, also be putting it on TV, on cable channels, but you do have to work with YouTube to be able to really get access to the mass audience. And those are sort of the three phases of that, and that all happened in the last 10 years, right? To be kind of this complete revolution of who's creating the content, who's viewing the content, and how you're watching the content.
Thank you. So at this point, maybe we can talk about moving in toward, as you said, these big brothers that you were looking to that eventually led to acquisition. You were evaluating, there was interest from many, and you had established relationships with several. How did you go about exploring those and then selecting, making the decision for acquisition?
I think there were, when we were looking at the acquisition route, and when it became the only route to kind of really pursue if we wanted to continue to build YouTube, we were looking at potential acquiring parties, and there were really only a few that could actually make the acquisition. And it was the Apple, the Amazon, and Google, Yahoo at the time, Microsoft, and I think from the very beginning when we were thinking about the acquisition route, we knew that if all equal, Google was going to be the party, the company that we would most like to work with. I said this last time, but just about everybody on that team had come from PayPal, and just about everybody on that team had directly experienced what it was like to go through an acquisition, from the acquisition of PayPal by eBay. And frankly, that was a horrible experience for everybody that was involved, right? The engineers, their names became anonymous. It was just, we need 3.5 engineers. We don't care who it is. We don't care who's sick. We don't care what they're, we just need 3.5 engineers to work for 14 days on this project, and then all we care about is that this product has to be launched on this date, and it has to be able to monetize, but we don't care specifically about any of the actual individuals that are working on it. And then it became sort of just this anonymized workhorse, and it didn't really get down to the layer of the contributors that are the individual contributors that are involved. And because it was such an heavy engineering laden company, we wanted to make sure that the engineers were going to be, still contain sort of the independence that they've always had working at YouTube. That was something that we always strive for, was that, we don't have any, one thing at YouTube, kind of stepping back, is just on the managerial side for me, when we were building out YouTube, there are a lot of key things that I noted when I was working at PayPal that I always said if I were to ever start a company, I would never do this. And who knew? Just 2 years later, 3 years later, that actually came to fruition.
What was on that list? I will never.
I think one key thing I think is that, granted, you have good individuals that actually pass through the whole application, resume, interview process. They are self-motivated. They do have creativity, assuming that's all checked, you don't want to put an artificial ceiling on that. And so if you define in too much detail exactly the date that you're supposed to finish something by, so even if you could stay up, and even if you wanted to stay up to finish it a day, 2 days earlier, there's no incentive, there's no bonus, there's no applause, there's no recognition for doing this. And what if you wanted to do something that was, if you saw some mistake in the actual formal product spec and you wanted to improve on it, you would actually probably get into trouble for trying to do, or even thinking out of the box. And I think that there was always this top down of sort of, whether it's from the VP, the business development, all the way down to product down. So the engineers are sitting at the bottom, so they're not really thinking about the company, thinking about it from the sort of improving the metrics that are actually truly important for the company. And so one of the things that I always wanted, if we were to create a new company, was to bring in engineers that had a good product sense. And not all engineers have that, but engineers that have a good product sense, know what the consumer actually wants, and they give them very high level but somewhat abstract metrics or goals, and then just let them take it from there. And so instead of writing these 25-page specs, which usually amounts to, what is this product supposed to be doing? Why is it doing this? Just leave it at that, about what are we trying to accomplish? And then we have a few high-level meetings about it, but let them take it from there. And that's how we were able to get engineers that were motivated to be working overtime, right? That were it was about getting these features out, experimenting. If you have an idea in your head, you're given full liberty to implement it and to get it out. And because of that incentive, they want to do it faster. They want to actually maximize the quality of it, versus being looked upon as just a factory employee and this is all you have to do today, and then you get your paycheck, right? Other things of just not having too many people in the kitchen at once. And so it was, I think ultimately, it was just a very small team, but it was all engineers, but engineers with a product design, user interface, flow sense. And so leading these teams, leading these actual products, and defining how the actual product would be used by the users were actually the engineers themselves. And then it was engineer-led teams leading other engineers. And so those were some of the things that we did differently at YouTube that was different from PayPal and eBay. And we also saw that when the acquiring party came along with Google, that was also a philosophy that was adopted and practiced at Google, a similar one where it cared about the identity of the individual contributors. It awarded people that were able to contribute more. And it respected the engineers themselves, respected the designers, respected the people that were actually core to building that product before it launched.
About how many engineers did you have on the team at the time, roughly, order of magnitude?
It's around 30 engineers at the time, which it's just a tiny number, but I think always when it's a smaller number of engineers and when there aren't, they're just a smaller number of qualified engineers are always able just to produce a lot more, just generate a lot more productivity. I think just because they're not constrained by anything.
When it came to thinking about acquisition as a solution, were all the founders in agreement? Did it change over time? And how did Sequoia or other investors feel?
Right, so I think there was always a little bit of contentious dispute between which route do you go down, IPO, acquisition, and kind of, well, that's the big question. And then if you were to go that acquisition route, do you do it now? Do you do it a year from now, 2 years from now? And then I think from there, it's the actual party that's involved in the acquisition. And evaluating on just pure returns for everyone, but specifically in the case of board members, board seats, in the case where you have Sequoia Capital involved, and for them to give the most back to their investors, it's going to be about going public. It's going to be about going IPO, or pushing it off as long as you can for additional funding rounds, and to be able to continue to see that growth metric persist for a number of years, and then sell it, not in 2006 like we did, but 2007, 8, 9, 10. But these problems that I talked about, they were just challenges that it wasn't that these challenges were only visible to us. It was visible to everybody that was on the board, everybody that was at Sequoia. I think it came down to whether or not their belief, kind of conviction that, can we solve this? Can we actually overcome these hurdles? And from the engineering side, I always said that we can actually scale. So don't worry about the engineering side. But from the legal side of things, as you start expanding globally and as you start working with these music studios, can this company of 55 people survive beyond 2006? And I think that those were the discussions about, can you guys do it? Ultimately, the way that some of these the agreements were written, we always needed it was mandatory that we get approval from Sequoia Capital before we could actually sell the company. We couldn't even consider an offer that was worth that was valued at less than $100 million. That was part of the contract, and luckily for us, we passed that pretty early on. But even when it came down to the actual $1.65 billion offer, to accept that from Google, we needed approval from Sequoia. And, it came down to whether or not this team could actually survive beyond 2006. And I don't, looking back in hindsight, I don't think we would have been able to do it without Google's help. We probably would have needed another big round of fundraising just to scale, and then there's just so many bridges to cross that with Google's help we were able to do it. Without that help, internationalization, mobile, legal, just scalability, all these issues we had problems with, and Google helped.
You mentioned, well, an IPO route is an obvious option. Did you take that off the table early on?
No, I think both options were continue to be on the table. I think that as it came down to it, when we started discussing the next step, though, about do we fundraise some more, or do you think at this point it is the time to not just to sell the company, but to I kind of think about it as working with in collaboration with another party with more resources to be able to help us, and that was one thing that we had private meetings with Eric Schmidt prior to signing the acquisition, and it came down to asking about sort of, will we replay that situation that we did at eBay and PayPal, where you just come in, let go of the senior executive team, and then run things your way? Will you be letting go of the engineers, and will you be just realigning the sort of the interests of what YouTube is doing with whatever the larger vision and goals of Google were, or will you let this team that's been able to work so well together, will you let us continue to do what we were sort of passionate about doing? And I remember there was that afternoon meeting with Eric that he came in and said, as long as you guys can continue to increase number of views, number of users, number of amount of content that's uploaded, you guys are the captains of the ship for at least another year or 2 years or down the line. And so after we heard that, we who knew what was going to happen after we actually signed the contract, but that was enough to say this is going to work out. Continue to this day. Google has offices all over the world, but in the Bay Area, main one's in Mountain View, another one's in San Francisco, but continue to this day, YouTube is still in the same location in San Bruno, so separate from Google. It was not, there's a lot of integration with YouTube to say, where's the mobile team that's going to be helping us? And so we were working with folks out of Seattle and out of New York, out of Zurich, out of Paris, out of London, all these teams all around the world as we started expanding to Asia, teams in Hong Kong, teams in Japan. But we were the ones that were actually making the calls about what we wanted to do rather than the opposite side of Google saying, this is what you need to do. And that was just the exact opposite of what happened, I think, with PayPal and eBay, and all the engineers that were a little bit cautious and cynical about another acquisition. I think in hindsight, they all thought it was the right timing and the right party to do it with.
Was that sort of almost like being a separate division of Google? I don't know exactly how you phrase it, but that was not worked out in advance as a condition.
Oh no! I mean, we didn't know what the organizational structure was going to look like after the acquisition, but ended up working out well. I mean, the engineering side reported up to the engineering side, and so I was working with Bill Korn, an SVP of engineering over at Google, and then was working with many of the other engineers from, say, the Google Video side that came in, the Google Maps side that came in to be able to help with a lot of the integration on the back end.
And how far down the road did you get talking to other potential acquiring companies, or at all?
We got pretty far. I think we got a few other offers. But still, I think the best offer, by a few definitions of just I think the team wanted to work with Google. They were most flexible with the actual offer, and then I think just in general, the way that their organizational structure was it was a lot of the engineers are strictly as engineers, and they would be able to still work as engineers. So it was more of a kind of more of a vertical structure, in that the engineers are engineers and the designers are designers, the product teams are product teams, and then they work together on products together. I mean, I think everything just seemed like it would fit well with Google, and so for everyone involved, from the investors as well as the actual employees, that were happy with the deal.
So let's talk about the deal. It's October, right, of 2006. Stunning news, right? The 1.65, is that right, $1 billion acquisition?
Yeah.
Less than 2 years old.
Was it? Yeah.
Right?
I think.
We've just gone through this story. You're less than 2 years old. You have about 70 employees, and this announcement comes.
Yeah. I mean, I know that it's hard to remember it all. I know that.
Is it just a blur, right?
I know it took about a week to, I mean, it was a very compressed period to have that first conversation with Google to the point where you signed and inked the actual contract at the time that it was announced to Wall Street. It was 7 days.
7 days from initial conversation to announcement, or
Right.
to agreement? To announcement.
To announcement.
7 days.
And the meetings, I think we talked about it, or it's public, that the meetings with, the team at Google, David Drummond, Larry Page, Eric Schmidt, they happened on this Woodside Road here at a Denny's, because we didn't want anybody on the YouTube side to know that we were talking to Google. We didn't want anybody inside Google to know that we were talking to YouTube.
Denny's was not a common destination for either group, right?
Right.
Nobody goes to Denny's. None of those people, I should say, would frequent Denny's.
Yeah, it's odd. I think memory-wise, it's all a little bit vague, but I remember everything that I ordered at Denny's. I remembered,
What did you
should I
eat?
be going to the bathroom when I leave, or should I just leave first and then go to the bathroom elsewhere? But, I think that it needed to be compressed together because of some of the legal strifes out there that it couldn't be, we couldn't publicly auction ourselves, just based on just where YouTube was at the time, and just working with Google, they understood exactly. They were able to place themselves in our shoes, and they knew exactly where we were coming from. And it was, it was a bet for them as well, because on the legal side, it wasn't that once you actually get acquired by Google, the legal problems go away. I mean, they still had to deal with it, and there are all sorts of because essentially in 1 week you turn from enemies to let's make up and we're going to acquire you. And I mean, things like first time meeting the Google video team, who had been our most bitter enemies for a year and a half. And in some cases, the acquisition is a confession of defeat to say you lost and we're going to acquire the team that beat you. And now you guys work together. There were cases where in Japan, Google Japan, the teams would go out there and they would meet with the big music studios out there, and say, sign a deal with Google Video, and we will help you defeat YouTube, who's stealing all your content and broadcasting it to the world. And then, a month later, you're walking into those same rooms, meeting the same people, and saying, we didn't really mean what we said a month ago. We bought this party, and let's work together. And so there were a lot of things like that had to get smoothed over when you're acquiring somebody that you've been competing with for such a long period of time. But everything happened very quickly, very smoothly. We had there were about 3 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, where we were at the Wilson Sonsini offices here in Palo Alto, just going over all the paperwork, and they brought in all the teams from the M&A side, from there was the legal side. There's a big party from the engineering side. They were looking at, they were just making sure that, let's take a look at the server logs to really make sure that what are your number of views, to take a look at your network traffic numbers, to really ascertain whether or not it's legitimate, the number of, and they were shocked at how much traffic we were actually using, because we've always been a little bit scared that implementing some of the AdSense, ad revenue shared tools that Google was offering that they would automatically already see how much content that we were getting. And so we only implemented AdSense on a fraction of the content. We didn't ever do it for all the YouTube content. So even for Google, they didn't exactly know the number of views we were getting, the amount of traffic that we were getting. So they were pretty astonished when they actually saw the real numbers, when we actually unboxed everything and let them see what we had inside. They took a look at all the actual source code that we wrote, and it was all in it was all written in Python at the time. Nobody had actually written anything that was that magnitude, top 2-3 website in the world using Python as a programming language. Guido van Rossum, the author of Python, was working at Google, and he was shocked that we were using Python at the back end of things to be able to write all of YouTube in this language. He came over the day after the acquisition and gave a talk to the engineers, and the engineers were just joyous that that they could talk to the author of Python. But Guido was pretty happy that he was there talking to the YouTube team, all experts in Python, and using it every day.
It's amazing coming together. Sort of poetic.
But the acquisition, we announced it on Monday, right after the market closed. There was a board meeting. There was a call with analysts, and we were sitting in that room with Eric, Larry, Sergey. We made the announcement to the team right before the actual call, and it was a surprise to everybody. Nobody knew about it other than our legal and financial, the CFO, and it just out of pure coincidence, it was also the date that we had scheduled for a move from San Mateo to San Bruno. And so they completely coincided with one another without any prior planning. And so it's, people are trying to find their desks, trying to set up their computers, and then we rush back and say, because what was it? We had to sign the paperwork there at Wilson Sonsini, and then we had to be back in, not back, like visiting San Bruno almost for the first time, to our new offices for 1:30 p.m. for the close of market to actually to make the announcement to the team, but then actually do the actual call with the analysts to make the announcement. And it was just, we'd already been up all weekend, and then that, I think we penned everything finally. It's how compressed that was to actually sell YouTube to Google, from the Denny's breakfast all the way to actually signing the final signatures to authorize that agreement in that amount of time. And so it's, with all the meetings with all the various teams at Google happening over a weekend rather than any weekday. And then finally signing that, and then driving probably 95 miles per hour across 280 just to get back to San Bruno to make the announcement and then get onto the actual the analyst call. And I think that it's hard to just even really remember the details of anything that happened during that time. But everything went smoothly. The call was the first time that I'd been on a Wall Street phone call where every word was being recorded, and so things were told to me about things not to say and things to say. Just getting coached about what I should say as a spokesperson for Google.
And the announcement to your team, describe where you were and the reaction, since that was news and big news.
Yeah, I think that general philosophy has always been that I think very appreciative of all the engineers. Just knowing that how much time and commitment that they were putting into it's just like all else. I think that you have to sacrifice something to be working on weekends, sacrifice something to be able to generate 80 hours of work. And so it was always being pretty open. Text messages, instant messages, emails. I was always open within the engineering team about, there was a, like email alias just to the engineers, and I was always sending emails there, notes from board meetings, from some of these other discussions that I was part of, just to be pretty open that all the engineers knew what was going on. I tried to explain to them the reason that we had to figure out the sort of audio signature tools, the libraries for that, was because it's not just do it, but it's because we needed to do this so we could work with the music studios, and this is a key part of actually just legally continuing to build out YouTube. And so it was pretty open to the engineers that everything that went behind the deal, why we made it, and then the actual deal itself. And then it was a few conversations just to learn whether or not the engineers would be happy with it. I mean, I don't think that we would have probably made a different decision, but it was up to me to make sure that the engineers actually felt they weren't getting cheated after working, a year and a half onto something.
Small question though. Why were you in San Mateo and then San Bruno, considerably north, where a lot of you guys had worked before?
You mean just moving the?
Well, I mean, you were in San Mateo, then you moved even further north.
Right.
But I mean, that's a long way from PayPal and some of the places a number of you had been.
I mean, I think the San Mateo office, we were just pushing the fire hazard boundaries of how many people we can keep in San Mateo. So we had to get out of San Mateo. The San Bruno office was it was convenient in that it's kind of equidistant from people that lived in the city, people that lived in the peninsula, and even some of the people that were coming in from the East Bay. And it's right off the highway there, right off of 280. You get on 280, 380, and so it was convenient for everyone. In terms of location, it wasn't something that you could just walk outside to, like in Palo Alto or San Mateo, just to get a bite to eat. But I think that's more of the Google-esque model of actually having great chefs come in, having just everything that you actually would be typically leaving the office for, trying to bring that into the office and bring a higher quality version of it inside the office.
I was thinking back, you talked about that fortune teller's prediction.
Yeah.
That you would never be rich. And you think about how many shares you and Chad and had.
No, I remember that when it came out publicly. It was that 2006 Time magazine, the Person of the Year, and it ended up being, I think, YouTube and the actual content creators. But I remember making that same remark to the actual, during that interview about that. I mean, not much to say about it other than just that was strangely still on my mind as maybe as something that continued to make me almost disbelieve that it was happening.
Oh, really? It wasn't real.
It's just always, in some ways, I think it was good because it kept me grounded to say, don't get ahead of yourself. Still, the finish line is still a foot away, and so, in some ways, it's kind of was the sort of energy, the fuel behind making sure that we always took another step forward to cross that finish line, and until you could really say the deal was not just penned, but after the deal, it's just like any VC investment. It's you don't make the announcement on Monday, and then on Tuesday you walk home with a briefcase of money in it.
Yeah, no liquidity.
It comes over a period of time. You're getting Google stocks. It doesn't Your vesting cycle is also extended because of the acquisition. We made sure that, we made sure that the employees were taken care of. There was there are things with acquisitions where it accelerates your vesting period. So if your vesting period is generally 4 years, you can accelerate it for most of these acquisitions. You move it ahead by, or you shorten it, you accelerate it by a year. So if you start in 2006 and you have to wait to 2010 to get all your shares, you actually now, after an acquisition, you just have to wait to 2009. But of course, as the acquiring party, they want all the senior staff to stick around for as long as possible. And in this case, Chad and I just said we would be open to not taking any acceleration at all, as long as all the other staff and all the other engineers were able to get that. They were offering us an additional $10 million to stay on board for another 4 years. And then this is way further down the line. And for me, I actually just respond with, if there's a way to be able to take that $10 million and just distribute it to the engineers instead. I think the $10 million would mean a lot more to the engineers than it would be to the actual founders. I always thought it was a little... it makes sense, but I always thought it was a little unfair that you have some of these engineers that are, I'm going to say, far smarter than I am, that are working just as hard, if not harder, but just because of the time and the situation that they were in when they actually came on board, they get 1/100th of what I would receive after an acquisition. And it's just thinking about it from that way, it's kind of always feeling grateful that that team stuck around for the same amount of commitment that I did.
So let's talk about post-acquisition phase. You did decide to stay, and then there were other, more legal challenges and other things that came. You had lived through and had those scars from a hard acquisition before. You had pledged to yourself that you would learn from those lessons, and then here you were. What was the post-acquisition time like? What were you working on, focusing on most?
Well, I thought that my motivation never really took a pause. I think prior to the acquisition, it was always, we need to survive. We need to make sure that everybody that's committing themselves to this, they're able to get something, some reward out of their work. Post-acquisition, I always thought that Google paid way too much money for YouTube, and so it was kind of wanting to make sure that they got what they paid for, and so the challenges there were, for me, a large part of it was internationalization. A large part of it was, integration into the rest of Google. It's I think it's often cited that acquisitions can fail, and even if they don't, the sort of total productivity of the party being acquired is always slowed down during that integration period. You potentially have to rewrite the entire application. You may have to migrate users using a new username, new password. You may have to. There's always something. To the point where what the customer sees to all the back end. And again, having gone through that with eBay and PayPal, knew that it was going to be a challenge to completely integrate. Just almost so many levels of who are the engineers reporting into, starting to have to, again, write peer-to-peer reviews on a quarterly basis for all the engineers, trying to actually slot in each of the engineers and trying to match them up with the engineers and the different levels of engineers at Google, reporting structures, and that's just organizational stuff, and then just trying to figure out what teams to work with. So the international team that we had who do they actually work with? And we had so many phone calls and so many meetings and video conferences early on, and it was just, it would start with, hi, my name is Steve. I manage the product and engineering team at YouTube, and who are you? And it would be, and where are you calling from? And it would be, this is Zurich, and this is the engineering, this is, we're responsible for this. And then it's slowly figuring out how to actually integrate the teams together and the products together and the engineering together. So, I mean, I think that I always felt that if I were going to exit and leave YouTube, I still feel committed to at least making sure that this this acquisition was carried out smoothly. So a lot of the things that we were trying to do, we were able to finish. And then if I were going to leave, I wanted to leave at a point where the integration was complete.
As part of this integration, there were all kinds of things about marketing and branding, culture, and you were in a different position, having built the company. Now you're integrated in that. You mentioned a few of the people that you worked with along the way and that you just invited back. Gideon,
Right.
had been your CFO. Do you want to comment about? You've talked a lot about the engineers. Do you want to comment on these other people that were key for YouTube and also as part of this transition? Do you want to mention any of those other figures that we haven't talked about yet?
I mean, it was mostly most tightly tied in with this group of 30 engineers. And so, they'd all been working for so many years together just to make sure that things went smoothly. I do remember that was a key part of it, was that even if we went forward with the acquisition, we just need to make sure that everybody that came along the way was happy about it. I remember the day after the acquisition, Google started sending truckloads of food to YouTube for lunch, and I think that for the engineers that had to go out for lunch, and if they weren't convinced that this was a good deal, when the free lunches came the next day, maybe that convinced them. We had a lot of things. I mean, we had like a swimming pool in the new building, and so they were happy to have that. You were able to actually start, you had a Google key card, and so for every office that Google had around the world, including the ones in Mountain View, you can actually start working out of there. We started expanding the offices inside Google, so there was actually a YouTube division that was inside Google, so some of the folks that were coming from the South Bay, they could actually sometimes work at Google instead. So that was a policy that I set that, look, at least 3 days out of the week you have to be in San Bruno, but if you want to work, you can't work from home, but if you want, you can work outside. You can work in Mountain View, and you can work at the Google offices, just down the street. Yeah.
Literally, our next door neighbors. Well, the legal challenges continued, and then that became part of what Google was facing and responsible for. Do you want to comment about that? And was that?
I mean, I think a big one, there were probably a lot of smaller ones that never reached my level, but the big one was this $1 billion lawsuit coming from Viacom. And I'm not sure exactly. I have some vague guesses, recollection of why it happened. I believe that it was negotiations carried on for a while. It didn't pan out, and then they said, we'll sue you instead for $1 billion. It was they were interviewing just the legal team was talking to everybody that was involved with YouTube. They took your computers and downloaded every chat message, every text, every email, everything that you had typed on the keyboard for a year and a half. And the ruling kind of went back and forth. But, it's going back to this sort of middle background legal ambiguity about user-generated content. And this is, I mean, YouTube is probably sits at the top of this, but Yahoo Messages, message boards, and eBay, I mean, there's so many of these services out there that have been created that's all about user-generated content. And, what if you sell something artificial on eBay? I mean, is eBay responsible for that? What if you post something on a Yahoo Finance message board that turns out to be just, fake news? Is Yahoo responsible for that? So I think when it came to, Viacom, it was just trying to figure out, this content that is popular, that is put onto YouTube. It's not just Viacom and YouTube, but it's just popular content coming from anybody out there that is probably not uploaded by that party, but the person that uploaded it really has no idea what they're uploading, whether or not that's owned, whether or not they have the distribution rights to this content, and it may actually get a lot of views and they may be incentivized to do it again. But it's not I think much of the time it's not that the user is trying to say, how do I break the law by uploading a piece of content. They're just trying to upload pieces of content that they like and they want to share it, and it just so happens that it's in that gray area between Viacom says they can't upload this content, and if you host and you've created a service that accepts this and shares it and is visible by people around the world, we're going to sue you $1 billion for it. And YouTube's on the other side to say, look, we follow all the rules and all the laws that say whenever there's a piece of content that's uploaded on a user-generated content site, we take it down, and in a more expedited manner than what the DMCA claims. But it's in that middle ground. All the emails that were looked at was trying to look at whether or not we created YouTube as a way to be able to distribute copyrighted content, with this user-generated content side being more of a facade rather than the intention of the site. And Viacom was saying, no, you guys created this just to be able to share Comedy Central videos.
So with that, we know how that resolved itself. There were, as you look back at this sort of on the sweep of your YouTube experience, it happened very quickly. It seems to have been much up and to the right, like your user views, and so many entrepreneurs talk about dark moments that they had, challenges, or they really hit a wall or had something where they were fundamentally questioning kind of the capacity to move forward. Did you have some of those along the way that we haven't talked about yet?
Not really.
Isn't that great?
No, I want to say, like, for better or worse, my personality has always been make the decision and act upon it before I think about what I'm doing. So when it came down to, there's so many instances of this. I when I moved to San Francisco, it was, it was my first house I've ever bought. And I looked at it on Sunday and I made the offer on Monday. And then Monday came back and said, there are 3 parties that are actually bidding at the same price. Do you want to bid more? But it's all anonymous. You don't, yeah. So I bid again, and I ended up winning that. When I moved out to the Bay Area, it's just, a lot of these things just speak about, and then thinking about what did I just do? And I think in some ways, I think it is a characteristic of an entrepreneur to be able to take some risks and to be able to, I think oftentimes you would make a pretty darn good decision just knowing what you know at this time. Surely, like, you could do more evaluation and analysis, and you can probably make a slightly better, more informed decision. However, I think most of the time, that first guess tends to be right most of the time. And I think as a startup, as an entrepreneur, it just makes sense to make that decision earlier, and then just work around and maybe evolve the product around that. So we had a lot of those things at YouTube, but we made changes quickly to the point where I think the problems that we faced never really blossomed, probably not the word, but never expanded to a point where it really kind of construed this idea that YouTube was going to fail. And so things like when we originally launched the site as a dating site, I mean, we joke upon it, but it was only a dating site for a week. In fact, like, we launched this thing, and I mean, I remember we launched it knowing before we even launched YouTube.com that this dating site idea is never going to work. But what the hell? Like, let's get it out there. It's a few commands. You type it on the keyboard. You launch the site. If no users use it, it doesn't matter. Nobody knows about the service anyway. And then as soon as we typed in the keywords, the commands to launch this, we started already working on changing this dating site into something else. But it's not a problem like some of these other companies would. It's a problem in that we had to somehow change the direction of what the company was doing, but it wasn't a problem in the grand sense that it really slowed us down for months. And so there were a lot of these decisions that we made, a lot of them on the hardware side that even to this day, if we didn't make those decisions quickly, the site would have just crashed. I mean, the site would have never survived past September, October, November. So I think that I mean, there was incident with, I don't know if we talked about it before, with MySpace and how it was trying to just stay on MySpace, but it was a fight to whether or not the users of MySpace was going to continue to let YouTube, whether they were going to be fighting and arguing and supporting YouTube to be continued on MySpace. So I think that we've, just like everything else, we faced a lot of the same challenges that other startups do, but just given the timeline of a year and a half from launch to selling, it's just everything from 3 days of, actually working out a deal, say, is it 1.2 billion or is it 2 billion, or is it, all right, let's settle in the middle for 1.65. I mean, it's like a telephone conversation. I mean, just everything was so compressed that I think we underwent everything that every company goes through, but it was just on 1/4 of the time.
So you made the decision to leave. What was behind that decision, and what came next?
This was so the YouTube launched 2005, sale 2006. And then I ended up leaving around 2010, 2011. And it actually gets, I mean, it's for personal reasons mostly. And it was kind of a life-changing thing. It was, and it's out there on Wikipedia, and it's out there in the sort of, even I wrote this after YouTube wrote this sort of, I think it's an autobiography, but it's in another language that I can't read or write. And so it's an autobiography written by, I don't know, not even a ghost author. It was it's an author because I can't, she just had to translate everything that, but everything was from the first person perspective. And even then I wasn't sure if I should actually mention this, but it's all in there. And so it, short of is in 2007, CNN and YouTube was doing the sponsoring the Democratic and Republican debates, and this was in North Carolina, where it was with CNN, and we had to all be out there. We were on CNN doing interviews. We were meeting with with Hillary and Obama. We were just sitting in one room shaking their hands. They want, I mean, I think it was just more formalities. like I don't typically drink period, and that was 3 days of just there was the actual events, but then like waking up at 5:30 a.m. to do interviews, local interviews, and then you had all these actual trucks out there that's actually broadcasting all this content, live content, stuff that's coming in from, actually stepping back, the reason why YouTube and CNN was collaborating was that instead of the questions coming from just the actual moderators, it was actually playing a video on this front projected screen on the stage that was actually coming from YouTube users, and just to make it a little bit more genuine, closer to the experience, to actually see the background of the person that has that concern, is asking that question. And it means a lot more to be able to see and feel and hear that, rather than just coming from a moderator reading off of a transcript. But it was flying back, and on that flight before it took off, I ended up having this seizure event, and this was on the runway before the plane took off. And luckily, the woman that was next to me was a doctor, and she was able to, she was there the whole time, so she had a good sense of what was actually happening. And then the Atlanta General paramedics came in and took me out and put me at Atlanta General for the day, for the night. I mean, I think after one of these general tonic-clonic seizures, you have actually no idea how much time passed, and you're under fluorescent light the whole time, whatever. So you day or night, or how many days had passed, no idea. And this was in July of 2007. So this was a year after the acquisition. And then after that, after that, the came back to San Francisco, and I think while at the emergency room there, they said, through one of the CT scans, we said we found something in there, but with CT scans, with technology, we have no idea what it is. Coming back, it was through Ron Conway, who was able to actually connect me with the neurology team at UCSF, and that's one of the luckily I was living relatively down the street from one of the top neurology hospitals in the world, and even then, though, they couldn't, unless they actually went inside your brain, there's really no way to tell based on just MRIs and CT scans and just Q&A, exactly what that amorphous black thing is. And so a lot of things came back, and it's I think you get these extreme cycles of you create something in 2005 that ended up being as big as you sell it. You travel all around the world, and then this thing happens. And so a lot of ups and downs during the compression of those few years. Luckily, they ended up putting me on this medication called Dilantin, which is a pretty strong medication, and that seems to have controlled it. But I think there's this notion of a seizure threshold that everybody has. And if you cross that, you have a seizure. And for healthy people that don't have seizures, it's generally a pretty high threshold. But you inch upon that threshold if you do things like not sleep, if you do things like drinking a lot, if you have a lot of stress. So there's a lot of, for example, there's a large percentage of seizure cases where it's a college student that is maybe their second semester as a freshman, and they have 4 finals the next day, and they're just on coffee, a lot of stress, and no sleep, and then they would have a seizure. And this is a pretty frequent occurrence. But the idea is that in my case, that threshold was lower, and so in normal day-to-day operations, it was fine. It was you go to work, you everything was okay. But if those variables that I'm talking about were all raised at the same time, then the likelihood of a seizure increases, and once you go over that threshold, it occurs. So the first time was everything. It was lack of sleep, tons of interviews, meeting like Anderson Cooper, being on CNN at the time, like meeting all these, Democratic candidates, and then flying back and just operating on East Coast time, and so all those were checked, and I think that's why the seizure happened. And unfortunately, in 2008, so advancing by a year, those 12 months, 2 more seizures happened. And so at the end of 2008 there, it was I was coming back from Thanksgiving in 2008, where the last seizure happened before the surgery, and we said, I went over to the neurosurgery department over at UCSF, and and it came down to, do you want to go forward with the surgery or not? It's an area inside the brain that I think with these seizures, we're not exactly sure what the cause of the seizure is. It's generally one area, well, it could be a lot of things, but it's generally one area of the brain that is firing off electrons, and it's actually, it could actually stop at a certain point, or it could completely cover the rest of the brain, and it goes into these general tonic-clonic seizures. In my case, luckily, it was an area where through the CT scans, MRIs, I don't even know, angiograms, and all these different tests that you do, they were able to figure out that it was in a certain part of the brain. And then you go through all these other tests. There's like a WADA test where they turn off your left side of your brain and then the right side of your brain, just to make sure which side of your brain is responsible for what. And even that, it came back as ambiguous, like we're not sure what the left side of your brain is doing, the right side of your brain is doing. And so if we're going to be operating on the left side of the brain, we don't know exactly what's going to happen if there's some mishap. But it came back to, it was November, had my final seizure before the surgery, and it was during Thanksgiving, and again, it was during that period where it was flying, lack of sleep, stress, all these things, being at home, which is stressful always, with parents. So coming back, it was in December when I ended up meeting with Dr. Michael Lawton there at UCSF, and we started talking about, what do you want to do next? We can put more medication on you, but we advise that, you're relatively young. We know exactly where the seizures are coming from, which is kind of lucky. And 2, it's in this temporal lobe area that we could actually get to and do the surgery. And I remember asking him, so how difficult is the surgery? How safe is this? And just out of a score from 1 to 10, and he still gave me like a 6 out of 10, which I don't know if that means it's...
You only gave it a 6?
Does that mean... is that an easy surgery or is that not? But maybe it's like everything I said earlier about, all right, let's just make that decision, or we'll figure out whether or not that was a good decision later. I said, why not? Let's do it.
This is December
of 2006. So we did the surgery on January 30th of 2007. I did remember, all right, let's get this over with. Let's do it as soon as possible. This was shortly before Christmas. And he had come back and said, he had put out his calendar and said, what about next week? Like, no, I mean, when I say as soon as possible, I don't mean that soon. Let's wait at least a month. So we ended up putting it on January 30th of 2009 when we did that surgery. And it's... Looking back upon it again, I know I'm not the only one to have gone through, a major, surgery. And I really didn't. I don't know. It was a. I felt like it was gonna. It just felt like I needed to do it, and in the worst case outcome, yeah, in the worst case, you're under general anesthesia.
That's kind of a cavalier description of the worst case. Right? There are a lot of worst cases in this case. Right? This was a big deal.
Well, actually, worst case under general anesthesia, if critical error happens and you die during the surgery, that's probably not the worst case.
No, that's not the worst case, right?
Right. I think it's when you wake up, and there's just things that they still don't know about neurology where with all the tests that they do, they still don't know exactly what was part of that left temporal lobe. They don't exactly know. There's things like the obvious things are like peripheral vision. There's a high chance that you lose peripheral vision, but like seeing color, certain spots just in your general vision that you can't see. I mean, general memory. Period. There's a lot of these little things that they just don't know. But it was this. It's called like a giant thrombosed aneurysm. So giant means anything that's over 3 centimeters. Thrombosed would mean that there's actually, aneurysm is more important. Aneurysm is just through the actual blood vessels, it starts actually, for whatever reason, expanding. And so instead of actually just blood flowing through it, there's a spot of that vessel that it starts expanding. And then the thrombosed part just means it's completely calcified, which is a good thing. Assuming that aneurysm, although it's big, it's 3 centimeters, if it's calcified, then it won't be growing any larger. And then there's sort of capillaries that over a period of time have actually grown and been able to push around that. So the blood, if you get an aneurysm over a 24-hour period, that is almost guaranteed that even if you were to survive, something's going to have some permanent damage, because you have to be rushed into hospital because a blood vessel just bursted in your brain. In this case, it seemed like it was calcified over a long period of time, and then capillaries kind of grew around that. So the blood was still actually moving from one side of the brain to the other, and none of it was actually leaked out. And so the surgery ended up going in there and kind of decalcifying it, removing what was 3 centimeters down into maybe a small raisin size. And you put these 2 aneurysm clips on both sides of this raisin. So in the case that the blood begins to flow again, it doesn't actually, get out, and it's actually it's actually clipped. It's
how long was the procedure?
Again, I was gonna say I have no idea.
You have no idea?
Because it's general anesthesia. They count down. There's all this preparatory work beforehand, and then you go in there, and it's just the actual surgeon. You don't even see him. There's all these meetings in preparation, but the day of the surgery, you're getting all this preparatory work done before the surgery room. You're getting put into the operation room, and there's just people milling around, but you have no idea who's who, what the people are doing in there. The anesthesiologist, that's an important one. Absolutely. And they come in and they count down this. You have 5 seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I just remember 3. That was the last number. And then you wake up so many hours later, and then.
What did you think when you woke up? That's.
I don't know if I would. I don't know if I was really thinking much. I would say that it's amazing how you can have a scalpel inside your brain, and then in 45 minutes after they patch it up, you can actually be engaging in a conversation again. Like that somebody's inside your brain cutting up like parts of it, decalcifying it, putting clips in there, and then as soon as they patch it up, you just wake up and you're talking again. But it was put into ICU for a couple days, and then everything seemed to work out. They were doing all the sort of tests. I think you have to do walk around so many steps before you get. I think you can get taken out of the ICU and walking up and down stairs before you can actually leave the hospital. There's all of these checks on you all throughout the time while you're in the ICU, and things looked like everything was going well with all that. And so I think within 3 days I was out of the hospital, and to think that you can go inside the brain, cut it up, and then be out in 3 days.
Well, what a relief. Boy.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
I mean, how did it feel like?
But I should wait because that's just the beginning.
Okay.
That was 2009, and I think in Western medication, whenever something like this happens, there's basically 2 avenues to go down. There's containment of whatever the problem is using medication, but it doesn't fix it. It just maybe raises your threshold, makes it a little bit more difficult for the seizures to occur, but it doesn't fix it. The only way to really fix it is to go in there with a scalpel and cut out whatever the cause is. So if you go through the operation, and if any time after that you still have an event that is indicative of something that compelled you to go ahead with the surgery in the first place, that means that the surgery wasn't 100% successful. And so unfortunately in 2009, for a couple more occasions, there were seizure-like events, and so the only thing that could be hoped for at that point was that albeit it wasn't 100% successful, it improved things, and so can you still get back onto medication, maybe at lesser amounts than whatever it was before, but well, compressed together and summarized, it's that I don't really think that it got much better. I mean, now I'm thinking back from like 2018, 2019, and so I have a far better analysis and far better view of like the actual events and what happened. I don't think it got any better. And this is getting into the details of it, but these you stopped having these tonic-clonic seizures, but you started having smaller seizures that are only about 10 seconds in length, but it is still the brain being rendered inoperable during that time. If you're a casual observer that's not educated in this area, you would actually have no idea. It would just be seeming like someone was just staring blankly for 10 seconds. But my wife, for example, Jamie, she knows exactly when something's happening. A doctor, a neurologist, they would know, especially given medical records. So throughout that time, as it kind of went from 2009, 2010, 2011, still was working at Google at the time, still was working at YouTube, although it after the surgery took some time off, and even going back, it was I think maybe the silver lining is that it puts a different perspective on the priorities of what we're living for in a way. It's uncontested that I am I'm sort of honored to have been the person that actually created something like YouTube. But at the same time, had this not happened, I just turned 40 this year, or last year. I would probably still be working 80, 100 hours at YouTube right now, today. I don't even know if I would be married. I don't know if I would have kids. I don't know if I would be doing anything other than, every year going to do more Democratic debates or Republican debates, traveling and doing all the things that I was doing. So I think in some ways, even though eliminating specifically the actual aneurysm and the surgery altogether, I'm healthier for it. And so that's kind of the silver lining. At least that's what I try to say, that, all in all, it's probably net positive. But throughout that there was a grand transition. I mean, starting line being the surgery. But after that, it was things like, getting married, kids, just thinking about doing something other than just 100% focused on YouTube, right? I think there was still a part of me that still says that if health was not an issue, if there was no fear that I could push all these things, I can go 3 days with very little sleep, or I could go with a lot of stress and a lot of travel and all these things, I would probably still, I think there's still a passion for being sort of an entrepreneur and just trying out new ideas and trying to create, solutions through through technology for problems that people face. And in fact, even after leaving Google and YouTube after this, a year and a half or so after the surgery, still got back together with Chad to create another company, still got back together with some of the ex-YouTube and ex-PayPal guys that I'd worked with in the past to create another company. So there's still something there that, I think, call it like almost a personal selfish passion, that when I'm not taking care of the kids, when I'm not, mowing the lawn or whatever it is, like what I'd like to do in my free time is to create and program and build something. But I know that it just won't ever be at the same level of, just like energy and time commitment as it was during that PayPal or YouTube time.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for sharing in such a personal way here with us about that experience. And
Shoot, I should say, wait.
You have more to add?
Yeah, chapter 2 is throughout that period from 2009 to 2018, actually May 18th, 2018, things didn't really completely get better. And so, there's a neurologist. I moved down from San Francisco down into the Palo Alto area, went from UCSF to Stanford Hospital. And there's so many changes, so it's really hard to say. Having kids, having family, moving, working, medication changes, the surgery itself. So who knows exactly what were the causes of some of the results of it. But what I was saying is that instead of having these what are called tonic-clonic seizures, they turn into complex partial seizures. And so instead of being out for a few hours and then having to sleep for a few days, you have something that's 10 seconds. You kind of wake up. You still probably feel a little bit like you need rest, but after 10 seconds, you're back and you never even fall. You're on your feet the whole time. But the frequency increased, right? And so to the point where, and it was gradually increasing to, it was maybe 2009, the year of the actual surgery, 2 times, 3 times. But then it started gradually increasing to the point where 2016, 17, it was almost happening every, say, like month and a half or so. And then it started getting to the point where you're kind of, especially coming from like the scientific engineering background, trying to almost evaluate every single second of your day to figure out. And some of the doctors actually don't think that there's any causal effect of this. I mean, there's that it's just a pointless exercise to actually try to deep dive into, you have a seizure, but don't look at what you did the hour, 2 hours, the day, 2 days before, because it has no relationship. Frankly, I think that that's BS. I think that there's definitely a causal effect to it, that not every day is the same. So things, just because I know that in the past it's always been a matter of stress and sleep, and alcohol is a big contributor to it. especially when the actual alcohol, I think when it leaves the system, when it's even like exercise, when it's the exercise, you're actually putting a lot more stress on your muscles, but then it's regrowing, and I think there's a lot of these, and only because of these seizure events have I actually started deep diving into this, but it started happening a lot more frequently, and so the reason I said May 18th, 2018 was because that was last year, I think exactly 363 days ago. So we're almost a year from the 1 year, exactly 1 year since my second surgery. So I actually went through a second surgery last year at UCSF, and this was a lot harder to decide on because I think the first one, worst case is, you don't wake up. But I think it's different when you have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, and so then it's all right. Worst outcomes, you don't wake up, but the impact for the family, and specifically, for wife and the two kids, and I remember my brother's a doctor, and he also said that you have to go talk to your kids before this. A 6-year-old has no idea what a neurosurgery is, but you have to have this conversation with them that there's a chance that, on Friday, it was on a Friday, both surgeries are on Fridays. And so, daddy's going to get this surgery done on Friday. And, Ethan, my younger one, he had no idea what I was talking about after I told him I was going to have this surgery. And I just want to tell you that, Daddy loves you. And he just went off, and I was like, oh, he gave me a hug, and then he went off and jumped and played. Jade, my older one, he had a lot better, and he's 8 years old. He had a lot better idea of what I was talking about. And yeah, he understood, and he was there for a while just trying to actually soak it all in. But since the surgery, unfortunately, again, it doesn't seem like it. Oh, well, so the first surgery was very, I think, it was still going into the brain and operating, but it was a surgery that didn't remove anything from the brain. It was more like mending something that seemed to have been developed strangely over the years. This surgery, this last surgery 363 days ago, was a lot more serious. It actually removed a part of the left, temporal lobe, and the sort of looking at the hippocampus area, that's even a bigger question as to, all right, we're going to remove a part of your brain this time. When you wake up, forget peripheral vision, are you still anything? Things like just vocal speech, vocabulary. There's all this that could be impacted. And again, the state in which neurological research is, we don't really know until we finish the surgery. You wake up, and even for 3, 4, 5, 6 months, your brain is still kind of during this recovery phase, so it's not a good time. You're supposed to go and see him right away, 3 months later, 6 months later, 12 months later, just to do all these more tests. So luckily, the surgery went okay, and peripheral vision was fine, and being able to answer all the sort of the questions that were asked of me. And again, it is such an odd experience. Same thing, counting down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I was again on 3. I don't remember anything, and then you just wake up, and it's a completely white room. Everybody's dressed, and it's unicolor in there. But as I was even just getting wheeled out on the bed, there was it was a different surgeon, neurosurgeon named Dr. Eddie Chang, this time still at UCSF. One of the top epileptic surgeons in the country. So again, lucky to be in this area. But, waking up from that, and the first thing I said was, "Good to see you, Dr. Chang. When are we going to do the surgery?" And again, I have no idea how long that surgery took. I knew it was I knew it was a 4 or 5 hour surgery, and it was general anesthesia all throughout that process. But again, you go in there at 6 a.m., you start preparing, and you're in the hospital the whole time. Everything appears the same. So, I really don't have any idea whether or not it was 1 p.m. that I woke up or 6 p.m. that I woke up. But again, 45 minutes ago, he's in there cutting off pieces of your brain, and then 45 minutes later, you're asking, "Dr. Eddie Chang, when are you going to begin the surgery?" And he was, he's happy to hear that, saying, "We're done with the surgery."
He's like really happy.
And I was so happy to hear that. We're done with the surgery. I'm glad to hear that
wonderful.
answer.
And that you're talking and
Yeah. And the kids were there right afterwards. But it's again, maybe this is diving into sort of something that's not relevant here, but in September 30th as well of 2018, there was another, and it was like a daytime seizure that still happened. And I have these Nest cameras in the kids' rooms, and I was putting one of my kids to take a nap, and so it happened in that room, and so it was caught on the Nest camera, and so there was, this is something that you can share, and it's viewable by other, professors or doctors, and it's indisputable that there was a seizure event. Again, it was like a 10-second seizure event, and so, I think that, again, if I were to draw a silver lining, it's that it's good that it keeps things a little bit more anchored and grounded, to say that just keep in the back of your mind that don't go too crazy with what you do in life, but do enjoy the experiences, the day to day. And so I think that the lucky thing is that threshold has been increased quite a bit, and so I'm able to start working at companies again, investing, meetings, doing all the things, doing travels, doing talks, and so forth. But I do know that at the same time, if I go for 2-3 days without adequate rest, for example, something may happen.